A deadly home invasion leaves a quiet suburban community in shock.
He was in the National Guard. He had his fatigues, his boots with him. It was very clear he had been shot multiple times.
The evidence points to a single-minded killer with intimate knowledge of their target.
Other than the broken door, nothing had been disturbed within the house.
Someone had forced it from the inside. It was not a break-in, but a break-out.
The killer had to have a very strong motive, personal or financial.
As the investigation unfolds, detectives find the victim was covering up a few secrets of his own.
There had been some child support issues recently with the first ex-wife.
I don't know any other way to put this except that he loved women.
He had a girlfriend that was engaged to another man.
She said he became upset and must have done this on his own.
When detectives have nearly closed the case, shocking details rise to the surface.
They talked about it jokingly. It would be nice if he got shot in a hunting accident.
She was this evil, manipulative wolf in sheep's clothing.
You know, sin has real-world consequences. In this case, someone got killed.
Saturday, October 22nd, 1988. It's just after 10 a.m. in Little Rock, Arkansas, when police receive a panicked call from a woman named Esther Watts. Esther says she was helping out her neighbors, Debra and Roy Taylor, when she made an alarming discovery.
They had keys to each other's houses. Debra was out of town in Texarkana with her brother. She calls Miss Watts and asks her to go over and check and see if she'd left the iron pressing machine on.
When she went over there to check the presser, she saw Roy laying on the floor. Neighbor sees he's unconscious, doesn't know whether he's dead or not, calls the fire department because she doesn't know what else to do. And then they call the police.
North Little Rock Police patrolman came to the house and went in and saw that Mr. Taylor was obviously deceased. It was very clear that from the initial examination that he had been shot multiple times. The fact that the neighbor didn't initially notice the blood, I think it's probably attributable to the shock. At this point, he backs out of the home and, of course, calls it in as homicide. He was in the National Guard, and that weekend he was getting ready to go to drill. He had his fatigues, his boots with him. Those were near the body. He was dressed in underwear and a T-shirt. Based on the examination of the body at the scene, it was determined that Roy Taylor had died earlier in the morning of October 22nd, or the very late evening of October 21st. They did find 3 projectiles on the floor. They appeared to be a .38 Special.
The lack of shell casings informs police what type of gun was likely used.
A revolver, once the projectile leaves, the casing stays in the gun. Unlike a semi-automatic gun, which ejects the casings, we didn't have a gun at the crime scene. So they searched the remaining portion of the house.
At the garage door, one major clue stands out to detectives.
It appeared to have been forced open. There was some of the casing or molding was cracked and broken, and the lock was in a locked position.
At first glance, it seems to detectives that Roy interrupted a burglary. But several telltale signs are missing.
There were no drawers pulled out, things turned over, nothing missing in terms of personal items or TV or recording equipment.
Other than the broken door, nothing had been disturbed within the house, so that's not a typical burglary.
Closer inspection of the broken door reveals a more unsettling possibility.
Someone had forced it from the inside. It was not a break-in, but a break-out.
This is a pretty clear indication that that damage had occurred after Roy's death by the killer trying to make it look like a forced entry into the home. The big question for law enforcement is who did this? The police, as part of standard procedure that day, talked to the neighbor who discovered the body about what they may have seen, learn information about Roy and Debra Taylor, their relationship with each other and with people in the neighborhood.
Roy Taylor was born and raised in the tiny town of Belleville, Arkansas, and grew up in a close-knit family.
He was in the kitchen a lot with his mom, cooking, and he hunted and fished and everything with his dad.
By the time Roy went off to college, he'd grown into a charismatic young man.
We were in Western civilization class, and I was sitting there one day looking at him, just admiring him. He was extremely easy on the eyes, very handsome. He met my gaze, and I was so embarrassed, and I said, "You've got the prettiest blue eyes." And he looks up, he said, "You're not so bad yourself, Toots." We wound up going out and married about a year later. He had a marvelous work ethic. Even when we were in college, he worked at night and got off at like 7 in the morning and made 8 o'clock classes. Then he joined the National Guard and got a job with Sears in the automotive store.
Over the next few years, Roy and Brenda had 2 children together.
He seemed to kind of settle down and, you know, be the husband, the father, that kind of figure the longer we were married. He just couldn't stay in one place, I guess.
Roy's wandering eye led to trouble at home.
I don't know any other way to put this except that he loved women. I got concerned that maybe I wasn't the only one. And I was right. It was several. And I wasn't going to live like that. We were divorced in '73.
Though the children lived with Brenda, Roy kept in contact.
His house wasn't but maybe a mile from us. And sometimes he would come take the kids on the weekends. We saw a lot of him, really.
Roy married again, but that relationship didn't last long either. By his late 20s, Roy had given up on love and was focused on his work until he met a beautiful young woman named Debra Bryant.
Debbie, she grew up in Belleville. We were best friends for a long time. She was very family-oriented. Yes, she loved her family.
She was working in a nursing home, and he had gone over there one of his trips up to his parents to see his aunt, who was a resident there, and that's where he met her.
She was a hard worker. She'd do about anything for anybody. I just loved her to death.
28-year-old Roy was instantly smitten with 19-year-old Debra, and the feeling was mutual. The two dated for little more than a year before tying the knot in 1977.
He was kind of laid back. But if he got to know you, he was Mr. Personality. I think they had a real good relationship.
The couple's first son was born 3 years after the wedding in 1980. Their second arrived 4 years later.
Debra was a wonderful mother. Those kids meant everything to her. Now, she loved the boys, but she wanted a little girl so bad.
Roy agreed to let them adopt a little girl.
Kept the boys busy keeping up with the sister. They went places together and done things and fished and hunted and done all that stuff with the kids.
Roy and Debra seemed to be ideal parents, and they were equally successful as business partners.
Roy and Debra had a pool business. They would install swimming pools, in-ground, above-ground type swimming pools.
Roy was the guy that did all the work. He would work out in the field with the homes and servicing, while Debra stayed at the office and was essentially the office manager for the business.
As the pool business grew, it provided the Taylors with a comfortable lifestyle in an affluent neighborhood.
They had a very nice home. Roy was still a member of the Arkansas National Guard. They participated in neighborhood activities, so it really appeared to be the American dream family.
But their seemingly charmed life has taken a tragic turn. Roy has been found shot to death, and Arkansas police find signs that this isn't just a burglary gone wrong. As far as the neighbor knows, she's the only person other than the Taylors who has a key to the house, and Debra is still out of town with the children.
When a spouse dies by homicide, that usually the other spouse is involved. But obviously his wife, Debra, and the children were not there. So first off, we need to talk to Miss Taylor. They still don't know how this all happened and who is involved. So obviously it leads a question is, what do we have here? Is this a intruder, or is this some kind of setup, or what?
Coming up, the coroner's report deepens the mystery.
The medical examiner theorized that Roy Taylor, he saw the attacker and saw what was coming.
But like the crime scene, not everything is what it seems.
I said, well, why don't you get out? And he said, I can't get out.
Little Rock investigators are within the first 24 hours of the murder investigation of Roy Taylor. And word is spreading quickly after neighbors found the body.
Saturday morning, after Roy's body was discovered, the family member called Debra in Texarkana and told her that Roy was dead and that she needed to come back.
She first gets her kids situated, and then she gets in her car and drives from Texarkana to Little Rock, and then talks to the police.
When detectives question Debra, she is distraught over her husband's death. She says she took the children to Texas because Roy was going to be busy with the National Guard all weekend.
She didn't want to be alone, and she wanted to see her brother.
Debra said she was utterly shocked when she got the phone call on Saturday morning. She didn't have any idea who would be responsible for Roy's death. She wasn't aware of any reason someone would want to kill Roy.
She says they had a picture-perfect marriage and a great relationship.
Detectives contact Debra's brother, who confirms she was with him. Police might not know who shot Roy, but on Monday, October 24th, an autopsy helps determine how it happened.
There was a wound to the front of his left forearm, exited on the back side of his forearm. In his chest area, there's a wound in his right shoulder from behind. The medical examiner theorized that the wound to the left forearm was a defensive wound and that Roy saw what was coming, and he raised his arm up. The bullet passed through the forearm, striking him in the chest.
The medical examiner also finds gunpowder residue on Roy's lower back and arm, indicating the shots came from close range.
The fact that it was clear that the sole purpose was to kill Roy Taylor meant that the killer had to have a very strong motive, personal or financial. We knew that Debra was not the trigger person because she was in Texarkana. So at this point in the investigation, the big question, if it's not Debra Taylor, what relationship or motivation could have prompted the killer to come and kill Roy?
When investigators talk to Roy's friends, they discover there were aspects of his life that Debra wasn't privy to.
Roy was a ladies' man. He was screwing around everywhere. He installed more than pools.
The fishing buddy had told the police Roy had a girlfriend and who was engaged to another man. He was seeing the girl whenever Debra's out of town.
According to Roy's friends, his lover has an impulsive fiancée who may have sought revenge.
The police did contact Roy's girlfriend and the person that she was engaged to, but they had good alibis, so there wasn't anything there.
Roy also has 2 ex-wives. Detectives wonder if either of them could have been involved.
Fairly early on, the second ex-wife was considered eliminated, but they learned that there had been some child support issues recently that had caused disagreement between Roy and the first ex-wife.
Detective Randy Johnson called me, asked me if I would come down to the police station. He said, "We've heard that y'all had been involved in a very bitter court dispute over child support." I said, "There wasn't any bitter court battle. We just walked in, signed some papers, and that was it." We actually got along better after we were divorced than we did married.
Brenda explains to police that Roy had another reason for spending time away from home.
About 2 weeks before he was killed, he and I were just sitting there at the table, and like a big tear, ran down his face. That wasn't like him at all. And I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Oh, nothing." And I said, "Home?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, why don't you get out?" And he said, "I can't get out." And that was the last thing I ever heard him say.
Brenda's depiction of Roy's married life is contradictory to Debra's, so investigators revisit the Taylor home.
The North Little Rock police had occasion to obtain written consent by Debra Taylor to conduct other searches, both of the home, conduct a search of Taylor Pool Company, looking for any types of records or any indication of a motive to have someone to have killed Roy.
The Taylors' financial records reveal that some suspicious changes were recently made to Roy's life insurance policies.
He'd already had $200,000 worth on his life, plus he had $50,000 life insurance policy for the National Guard. It was Roy that asked to have the insurance increased, and they bought another $300,000 worth of insurance on his life.
Roy, he felt like whole life insurance policies were a good investment and that he wanted to increase the amount of the whole life insurance to over $500,000.
Despite Debra's alibi, the discovery raises red flags for investigators.
The fact that someone bought life insurance just a few months before his death would automatically have the police suspect the person who's the beneficiary. In this case, it would be Debra Taylor.
After discovering Debra Taylor stood to gain over $500,000 from her husband's death, Little Rock police are reevaluating her potential involvement in the murder. On October 26th, 4 days after Roy's death, friends and family gathered to say their final goodbyes.
Roy's family arranged a funeral in his hometown of Belleville, Arkansas. Police are getting information from the attendees that something was off. People indicated that Debra did not appear to be a grieving widow to any degree.
Roy's loved ones are primarily concerned that Debra came to the funeral with a man named Henry Price.
Henry Price had known Roy and Debra for 12, 13 years. He'd performed work for the pool company.
But according to attendees, Debra was acting as though Henry was more than just a friend. So detectives angle their investigation toward Debra and her new beau.
On their return to North Little Rock, the North Little Rock police placed them under surveillance, and they followed Debra and Henry.
We loaded up in our cars and had assignments. I think there was like 5 of us going to trail this person.
The main goal was for the surveillance team to catch the two together, if in fact that was the truth, and to get photographs.
Surveillance and followed her to a local La Quinta Inn hotel. And lo and behold, Henry Price was checked into the hotel.
Team members observe the two as they spend a romantic night together.
We were able to get photographs of them acting like a couple, lovers, if you will.
It just raised a lot of suspicions, and that was really putting her and Henry on their radar screen.
Detectives find out Henry is estranged from his wife, Sherry. So they interview her to learn more about him.
We bought a swimming pool from them, and then my husband started working on the motors of the pools for extra money on the side. I liked Roy. He was very nice, kind person. Not so much Debra. She seemed to be kind of sneaky and conniving.
Because Debra ran the business side and Roy was very rarely in the office, the friendship developed between Henry and Debra.
Sherry tells investigators she found out the two had been having an affair on October 1st, 3 weeks before Roy's murder.
Debra called when my husband and I were together, and I heard her on the phone. She called and said the coast was clear, and he was supposed to go over to her house. That's when I first accused him of being unfaithful. And I asked him to make a choice between me and the children or her. and he chose her left.
Sherry says she has no idea how far Henry might go to please Debra.
Puzzle pieces are starting to come together. At that point, they didn't have any information as to where Henry Price was on October the 21st and 22nd. But Henry Price, present in behavior with her at and after the funeral, in addition to the Taylor's increase in the life insurance, is starting to strongly indicate that Henry Price is the trigger man.
Coming up, a suspect is cornered.
My daddy always taught me, you can't catch a fish unless they open their mouth.
And investigators get a surprising confession.
He had stolen a .38 pistol so it could never be traced back to him.
Little Rock police are 10 days into the 1988 murder investigation of Roy Taylor. They subpoena Henry Price and Debra Taylor's phone records to build their case. Though an affair isn't proof of a murder plot, Henry Price seems to be the most likely gunman.
In examining the Taylor's phone records for the landline, there were numerous calls in the preceding months to and from the Taylor phone and Henry Price's phone.
One call in particular catches their attention. One that Debra never mentioned, that came in after the time frame of Roy's murder.
And that call was made Saturday morning from the Taylor home phone to Debra's brother's home phone in Texarkana. And it was very short. We think after Roy's death, someone other than Roy Taylor had placed that call. So to the detectives, this was a clear indication that whoever killed Roy Taylor called Debra Taylor and let her know the job was done. At this point, detectives decide it's time to hear from Henry Price. They call him up, invite him down to the police station. It starts off, Henry is explaining his business relationship with the Taylors, his friendship with the Taylors, how long he had known them. No mention of any romantic involvement with Debra Taylor. Detectives advised him that they had been surveilling him, showed him photographic evidence of that. At this point, I think Henry pretty much knew that this was going bad for him, and that's when he started opening up. Henry told them that Debra had told him that Roy was abusive. He said that she had a bruise that Henry had seen.
She also had Henry believing that Roy had found out about him and Roy was out to kill him.
Henry said that they then began hatching different plans to kill Roy Taylor. And ultimately, they decided that Henry would go into the home, lie in wait, and kill Roy while Debra was at her brother's house in Texarkana. Henry said that he had stolen a .38 pistol from his brother-in-law.
He went over there, actually parked the car on the backside and walked through a trail to get to the house.
Henry says Debra had already provided him with a key to get inside.
He entered through the back door. At that time, Roy Taylor walks in and with his clothes getting ready to guard drill.
That's when Henry, he shot 3 or 4 times. killed him.
Henry confirms he was the one who made the phone call from the Taylors' home after the shooting.
On a prearranged plan with Debra, he calls her at her brother's house, and the code to let her know that Roy was dead was, you need to buy a black dress. And that was his way of letting Debra know that he had killed Roy. He apparently, to make it staged as an intruder burglary, breaks in the garage door and then flees the scene. He took a gun, disassembled it, drilled out the barrel, and threw it into the Arkansas River. Henry Price's interview at the North Little Rock Police Department was pivotal. There was a lot of suspicion, but there was no direct evidence. If Henry had simply came into the department and said, I want to talk with a lawyer, I'm not going to talk to you all about that, I don't know where this case would have ended up.
My daddy always told me, he was a lawyer for a long time. He says, you can't catch a fish unless they open their mouth.
Armed with Henry's confession, police prepare to confront Debra. But before they can contact her, she calls them.
Henry has called Debra and said, the police have called me. They want me to come down and talk to the detectives about Roy's death. Debra, I guess in an attempt to salvage this, calls the police department and says, I want to come down and talk about this.
When Little Rock investigators meet with Debra Taylor, she seems eager to tell her side of the story.
When Debra arrived at the Detective Bureau, she was placed in an interview room. She proceeded to sit on a table in a seductive manner. Debra Taylor at this point, I believe, was thoroughly convinced in her ability to manipulate people and the situation, but then the detectives advised her that they had Henry Price and that he had confessed to the killing of Roy Taylor.
According to Debra, Henry was a simple man who'd misinterpreted the things she told him.
Debra fairly candidly admitted that she and Henry had discussions about possibly killing Roy, something happening to Roy. But she said she wasn't really serious about that.
They talked about it jokingly. You know, it'd be nice if Roy had a heart attack and died. Henry had said one time, well, we could hire somebody to kill him, and kind of jokingly, and she said, no, that someone would find out about it. But apparently Henry was pretty serious.
So the police questioned Debra, why didn't you tell us about Henry, your affair with Henry, the abuse at the hands of your husband? She said Henry became upset and must have done this on his own.
Debra denies any involvement in Roy's death, but police aren't convinced, especially considering Roy's recently adjusted insurance policy. They still believe she seduced Henry into doing her bidding.
It became obvious to me that Debra had this non-sexual relationship with Henry up until the summer. And in that summer, she made her mind up to get rid of Roy.
She thought there's no way that Roy would ever let her get a divorce. Debra said that he stated that you'll never leave me. I'm not going to be a 3-time loser.
I think she knew Roy was screwing around on him and that she was not happy. And that in order to leave Roy, keep the children, and have a comfortable way of life, she needed the insurance policies, she needed a house, and she needed the proceeds from the pool company.
Investigators suspect that when it came time to hire a hitman, Debra already had the perfect person.
Henry wasn't dumb, but he was so naive and socially awkward. I think she spun her web and pulled Henry in. She was the driving force. She's the one that devised the plan for her to be out of town, for Henry to go into the house and kill Roy.
She might as well have pulled the trigger.
Based on the evidence and Henry's confession, he and Debra are both charged with capital murder. The arrests come as a shock to friends and loved ones.
Debbie called me from the police department after they booked her. And I said, "Why did they arrest you?" And she says, "They think I killed Roy." I said, "Did you?" And she said, "No." I believed her. She was my friend, and I believed her.
I think she had convinced him that her husband, Roy, was abusing her. It just was really hard to believe that anybody could be like that, particularly Henry. I mean, he was not geared that way, made that way. I never saw him being aggressive or anything. So, it just seemed impossible.
Prosecutors are concerned a jury might also find it hard to believe.
We thought, a fairly strong circumstantial case against Debra. But we were afraid of the possibility of a hung jury, possibly somebody not believing the circumstantial evidence and acquitting Debra Taylor. And so the police and the Taylor family and I all met, and it was determined that it was more important to get Debra Taylor convicted. So that's when the decision was made for a 40-year plea agreement contingent on Henry testifying at trial against Debra.
Seven months after the death of Roy Taylor, his wife Debra goes on trial. She stands accused of being the mastermind who planned the shooting.
She was charged with capital murder originally, and after we made numerous motions and hearings, they waived the death penalty and just went for life without parole.
Debra always wore this very demure church-type clothes, and carried a Bible at times, presenting herself as this person who was not capable of something like this.
The prosecution's key witness is the confessed gunman, Henry Price.
He, on direct and even more so on cross-examination by the defense attorney, said that he truly believed that Roy had done these terrible things to Debra. And although there's no direct evidence of any of that, except one neighbor at one time saw what appeared to be a black eye. But I knew that Debra Taylor was this evil, manipulative wolf in sheep's clothing.
He said, "I would never kill Roy to get Debra, but I did kill Roy to protect Debra."
Despite Henry's vehemence, investigators are unable to officially corroborate Debra's claims of abuse.
They asked Henry, "Were you in love with Debra?" He said, "Oh, yes, very definitely. They'd planned a life together." And prosecutor asked him, "Well, do you still love her?" And he looks over at the table where she's sitting, and he said, Yes, I am.
So my next question to Henry was, well, Henry, what does that make you if everything Debra Taylor told you about Roy abusing her was not true? It'd make you a dupe, wouldn't it? And Henry said, I don't know what a dupe is. What is that? And that was the whole essence of this relationship.
The defense has a surprising star witness of its own.
Normally, you don't put your client on the stand, but in this case, there wasn't any way in the world that a jury was going to do anything but find her guilty unless she took the stand. Debra did a very good job. She explained things very coherently.
She described in great detail the abuse that she alleged she suffered at the hands of Roy Taylor. She admitted that she had talked to Henry Price about this, but that Henry had acted independently and on his own, and that she had no involvement in the execution of Roy Taylor.
Once all the evidence is in, the jury takes just 50 minutes to reach a verdict.
They found her guilty and gave her life without parole. Instead of being weak and frail, she came across cold as ice. And I think that's what caused the jury not to believe her. I'm sure there's lots of different ways that could have been prevented, this crime, but sin has real-world consequences. In this case, someone got killed.
I just wanted to portray him as he really was, not as some abusive man. I did absolutely adore him. He could walk in a room and just, without even trying, command the room. I think about the way he left here, and I don't care what kind of man you are, nobody deserves to die the way he did. At all.
The phenomenon of domestic crimes, particularly those motivated by financial gain and romantic entanglement, represents one of the most tragic and complex areas of criminological study. These cases occur with unsettling frequency because they are born in the private spheres of human life, where trust is assumed and vigilance is naturally lowered. In the quiet landscapes of suburban communities, where manicured lawns and successful business ventures project an image of peace and prosperity, the underlying human elements of greed, discontent, and manipulation can quietly fester. The transition from marital discord to a coordinated conspiracy is rarely sudden. Instead, it is often a gradual erosion of moral boundaries, fueled by the illusion that a violent act can solve personal and financial complications without consequence. This specific case, occurring in the late autumn of 1988, offers a profound look into the psychology of domestic conspiracy, the deceptive nature of appearances, and the meticulous investigative techniques required to dismantle a carefully constructed alibi. To understand why these tragedies occur, one must analyze the primary motives that drive individuals to turn against those to whom they have pledged their loyalty. In many domestic conspiracies, the motive is twofold, combining intense financial desire with the pursuit of personal liberation. When a relationship deteriorates, a standard divorce often involves the division of assets, potential alimony, child support, and a significant reduction in lifestyle. For an individual characterized by high levels of self-interest and a desire to maintain control, the prospect of a conventional separation is highly unappealing. Instead, the existence of substantial life insurance policies presents a dark alternative. In the minds of the conspirators, the elimination of a spouse not only removes an emotional obstacle, but also secures a massive financial windfall, allowing them to retain the family home, the family business, and an affluent lifestyle. This intersection of material greed and personal convenience is the fertile ground where such plots are conceived, showing how easily some can compartmentalize their actions when substantial material rewards are involved. The investigation into the tragic passing of Roy Taylor highlights the critical role of physical anomalies and behavioral clues in solving complex domestic cases. When the North Little Rock Police Department arrived at the suburban residence on Saturday, October 22, 1988, they were presented with a scene that initially resembled a burglary gone wrong. However, experienced detectives quickly recognized that the physical evidence did not align with a standard home invasion. The most significant physical clue was found at the garage door. While the door showed signs of forced entry, closer inspection revealed that the molding and casing were broken in a manner indicating the force had been applied from the inside rather than the outside. This crucial distinction, known as a breakout rather than a break-in, immediately alerted the investigators that the crime scene had been staged. A genuine intruder would have no reason to force open a door from the inside to gain entry, and this physical anomaly pointed directly to an insider who wanted to create the illusion of an external threat. Furthermore, the lack of standard burglary markers supported the theory of a targeted attack. In a typical home invasion, the perpetrator is driven by the desire to quickly acquire valuable items, resulting in disarray, pulled drawers, overturned furniture, and missing electronics. At the Taylor residence, nothing had been disturbed, and valuable personal property remained untouched. This absence of typical chaotic search patterns indicated that the perpetrator had a single-minded focus to end the life of Roy Taylor. The physical evidence on the victim's body also provided critical insights. The presence of gunpowder residue on his lower back and arm suggested a close-range encounter, while a defensive wound on his forearm indicated that he had briefly perceived the threat before the fatal shots were fired. The absence of spent shell casings at the scene suggested the use of a revolver, a weapon that retains its casings after firing, which limited the type of firearm the police needed to look for. As the investigation deepened, the focus shifted from the physical scene to the financial and behavioral records of the household. A routine audit of the family's financial documents revealed a highly suspicious pattern of behavior in the months preceding the crime. The life insurance coverage on Roy Taylor had been increased by an additional $300,000, bringing the total potential payout to over $500,000. In any homicide investigation, the beneficiary of a newly increased life insurance policy immediately becomes a person of interest. When this financial discovery was coupled into hot behavioral observations, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. At the funeral in the small town of Belleville, observers noted that the behavior of the grieving widow did not match the expected gravity of the occasion. More importantly, she was accompanied by Henry Price, an associate of the family pool business, with whom she appeared to share an unusually close relationship. The sophistication of the criminals in this case was heavily undermined by their own behavioral inconsistencies and the electronic breadcrumbs they left behind. While they had carefully planned an alibi, securing a location in Texarkana with family members to establish physical distance from the crime scene, They failed to realize that their subsequent actions would betray them. The decision to place a brief phone call from the victim's residence to the alibi location immediately after the crime was a fatal mistake. By analyzing the telephone records of the landline, detectives identified this highly unusual communication, which occurred at a time when the victim was already deceased and the wife was supposedly asleep miles away. This electronic record shattered the defense timeline and suggested that an accomplice had used the home phone to signal the completion of the deed. The surveillance of the suspects in the days following the funeral provided the final behavioral confirmation the police needed. By following the widow and Henry Price to a local lodging establishment, the surveillance team obtained photographic evidence of a romantic relationship that contradicted the widow's claims of a happy, uninterrupted marriage. This discovery allowed investigators to understand the true dynamic at play: a close relationship between a manipulative individual and a compliant partner who could be persuaded to perform a violent act under the guise of protection. When confronted by Tahas, this photographic evidence and the realities of the investigation, the accomplice confessed, detailing the entire plan, including the key provided to him, the staged garage door, the disposal of the .38 caliber weapon in the Arkansas River, and the prearranged verbal code used to signal that the act had been completed. Reflecting on this tragic case yields several profound life lessons that can help prevent similar occurrences in the future. First, it emphasizes the importance of community vigilance and the willingness to speak out when unusual relationship dynamics or patterns of behavior are observed. In many such cases, friends, family members, or neighbors notice subtle signs of trouble, unfaithfulness, or distress, but choose not to intervene out of a desire to respect privacy. While privacy is important, open communication and supportive intervention can sometimes disrupt an escalating cycle of domestic distress. Additionally, this case serves as a warning about the destructive nature of blind trust and emotional manipulation. Individuals who find themselves in complex or troubled relationships must seek objective, professional guidance rather than allowing themselves to be drawn into illegal schemes or acts of desperation under the influence of a dominant personality. For law enforcement, this case offers valuable strategies for accelerating the resolution of domestic conspiracies. The speedway kepai tahat, which this case was resolved, was directly attributable to the systematic application of standard investigative protocols. By immediately securing the crime scene and analyzing the physical entry points with a critical eye, the initial responding officers prevented the staging from deceiving the department. The prompt execution of a financial audit and the rapid acquisition of telephone toll records were also essential in establishing the motive and the connection between the conspirators. In modern investigations, the immediate preservation of digital evidence, including mobile phone location data, financial transactions, and communication logs, is paramount. By combining rigorous physical forensic analysis with swift financial and electronic surveillance, law enforcement can quickly break through staged alibis and identify the true perpetrators. The detailed narrative of this tragic event begins on the quiet, crisp morning of Saturday, October 22, 1988, in a peaceful suburban neighborhood of North Little Rock, Arkansas. Shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning, a call was placed to the emergency services by a concerned neighbor named Esther Watts. She had been asked by her neighbor, Debra Taylor, who was currently out of town in Texarkana, to check on the residence to ensure that an iron pressing machine had not been left running. The neighbors shared a close relationship and routinely kept keys to each other's homes for convenience and security. Upon entering the quiet house, Esther Watts walked toward the utility area to check the appliance, only to discover the unresponsive body of Roy Taylor lying on the floor. In a state of shock, she contacted the local emergency services, initially unsure of the nature of the situation. A patrol officer from the North Little Rock Police Department was the first to arrive at the scene. Upon entering the home, he quickly determined that Roy Taylor was deceased and had sustained multiple injuries that were clearly the result of a deliberate assault. The officer immediately secured the perimeter, backed out of the residence, and initiated a homicide investigation. The victim, a dedicated member of the Arkansas National Guard, was found wearing light domestic clothing, and his military fatigues and boots were placed nearby, indicating he had been preparing to attend a scheduled weekend drill. The medical examiner later estimated that the passing of Roy Taylor occurred in the early morning hours of October 22nd, or the very late evening of October 21st, 1988. During the initial processing of the crime scene, forensic investigators discovered 3 projectiles on the floor, which were determined to be of a .38 special caliber. The absence of spent shell casings suggested that the weapon used was a revolver, which retains the casings within the cylinder after firing. As the search of the property continued, detectives examined the garage door, which appeared to have been forced open. The wooden casing and molding were cracked, and the lock remained in a locked position. While this initially suggested a burglary, the interior of the home remained perfectly orderly. No personal items, electronics, or valuables had been taken, and no drawers had been searched. A closer forensic examination of the damaged garage door revealed that the wood fibers and molding had been forced outward from the inside of the garage, indicating that the damage was created after the crime occurred to mislead the police. With the staging of the crime scene exposed, detectives began to gather background information on the victim and his family. Roy Taylor had grown up in the small community of Belleville, Arkansas, where he was known as a hardworking, highly charismatic individual. He had joined the National Guard and successfully managed a local automotive service department before establishing a swimming pool installation business with his wife, Debra. The business had become highly successful, with Roy managing the field operations and installations, while Debra handled the administrative duties and managed the office. This successful business venture allowed the couple to enjoy a comfortable lifestyle in a desirable suburban neighborhood. However, interviews with acquaintances revealed that Roy had a complex social life and was known to engage in romantic relationships outside of his marriage, which had caused tension in his domestic life. Detectives made contact with Debra Taylor, who had returned from Texarkana upon receiving the news. She expressed deep shock and grief, stating that she had taken the children to visit her brother because Roy was scheduled to be away at his military drill all weekend. She claimed that their marriage was highly successful and that she knew of no reason why anyone would wish to harm her husband. While her physical presence in Texarkana was confirmed by her brother, investigators remained analytical, particularly after a routine check of the family's financial records revealed that the life insurance policies on Roy's life had been increased to over $500,000 just a few months prior to the incident, with Debra designated as the primary beneficiary. The investigation took a significant turn during the funeral services in Belleville. Attendees noticed that Debra S. demeanor did not reflect the deep mourning expected under the circumstances, and she was observed in the close company of Henry Price, an individual who performed contract maintenance work for the pool company. Upon returning to North Little Rock, detectives initiated physical surveillance on both individuals. This surveillance quickly produced results when the team observed the two checking into a local lodging establishment and behaving in a manner that confirmed a close romantic relationship. Investigators then contacted Henry S. estranged wife, Sherry, who revealed that she had discovered the relationship between her husband and Debra several weeks prior, leading to their separation. Armed with this information, detectives obtained the telephone toll records for the Taylor residence and Henry Price phone. The records revealed numerous calls between them in the weeks leading up to the crime. Crucially, a very brief call had been placed from the Taylor landline to the brothers' residence in Texarkana in the early morning hours of October 22, 1988, shortly after the estimated time of Roy S. passing. This communication, occurring while Debra was supposedly asleep in Texarkana, suggested that the perpetrator had used the home phone to send a signal that the task had been completed. Detectives invited Henry Price to the station for an interview. Initially, he attempted to describe his relationship with the Taylors as strictly professional. However, when presented with the photographic evidence from the surveillance operation, his composure faltered, and he began to speak openly about the events. Henry explained that Debra had led him to believe that she was experiencing severe domestic difficulties and that Roy represented a threat to her safety. He claimed that she had convinced him that the only way to ensure her security and their future together was to eliminate her husband. Together, they had developed a plan where Henry would enter the residence using a key provided by Debra while she was away in Texarkana, establishing her alibi. Henry confessed that on the night of the incident, he had parked his vehicle at a distance, walked to the residence, and entered using the key. He waited for Roy to return, and when the victim entered the utility area, Henry fired the weapon multiple times. He then placed the short phone call to the Texarkana residence using the prearranged coded phrase advising her to purchase a specific color of dress to signal that the act was complete. He then staged the garage door to make it appear as though an intruder had forced entry, disassembled the weapon, and discarded the pieces in the local river. Following Henry's detailed confession, detectives prepared to interview Debra Taylor. Before they could reach out, she contacted the department, having learned from Henry that the police were asking questions. During her interview, she attempted to portray herself as an innocent party who had merely engaged in theoretical discussions about her husband's passing, claiming that Henry had misinterpreted her words and acted entirely on his own initiative. She denied any active involvement in the planning of the crime. However, the prosecution presented a compelling case of conspiracy, highlighting the financial motive of the $500,000 insurance policy and her coordination of the alibi and the communication signal. To ensure a successful conviction and avoid the risks of a protracted trial, the prosecution offered Henry Price a 40-year plea agreement in exchange for his complete and truthful testimony against Debra Taylor. At the trial, which took place 7 months after the tragedy, Henry testified in detail about the manipulation he had experienced and the coordinated nature of the plan. Despite the defense's efforts to portray Debra as a passive observer Her own testimony on the stand, which appeared highly calculated and detached, failed to convince the jury. After deliberating for only 50 minutes, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This case remains a solemn reminder of the destructive consequences of greed and deceit, and a testament to the dedication of the law enforcement professionals who worked tirelessly to bring justice to the memory of Roy Taylor. The phenomenon of intimate partner homicide, motivated by financial gain and interpersonal conflict, remains one of the most studied areas in modern criminology. In quiet suburban communities, where safety is often taken for granted, the occurrence of such tragic events causes deep shock and prompts serious reflection on the nature of human relationships and security. Criminological analysis shows that these crimes frequently arise from a combination of deteriorating marital relations, extramarital involvements, and the perceived opportunity to acquire significant financial assets through illegal means. The perpetrators of these acts often operate under the cognitive bias of overconfidence, believing they can orchestrate a sequence of events that will shield them from suspicion. However, the reality of forensic science and systematic law enforcement investigation consistently dismantles even the most calculated plans. By analyzing these occurrences, society can learn valuable lessons about the early warning signs of dangerous domestic conflict, the critical importance of transparent legal resolutions such as divorce, and the undeniable efficacy of modern police investigative methods. When analyzing why these specific types of crimes occur with some frequency, it is essential to examine the underlying psychological and socioeconomic factors. In many instances, an individual finds themselves trapped in a marriage that has lost its mutual respect and affection, yet they are unwilling to face the emotional, social, and financial consequences of a standard legal separation. A divorce often entails the division of assets, potential child support payments, and a significant reduction in lifestyle. For a highly manipulative person with narcissistic traits, this outcome is deemed unacceptable. Instead, they begin to view the demise of their spouse as a viable solution that not only preserves their social standing, but also provides a substantial financial windfall through life insurance policies and sole ownership of joint business ventures. This transition from marital dissatisfaction to conspiratorial intent is often facilitated by the introduction of an outside romantic partner, who becomes either a co-conspirator or a physical tool to execute the deed. Criminologists refer to this dynamic as a conspiracy of convenience, where the mastermind utilizes the emotional devotion of another to distance themselves from the physical act of violence. The reliance of law enforcement on specific details and physical clues is paramount in solving these complex domestic conspiracies. In almost every staged crime scene, the perpetrator makes fundamental errors that stem from their lack of genuine criminal expertise and their misunderstanding of physical mechanics. A common tactic is to attempt to make a targeted homicide look like a random burglary gone wrong. However, experienced detectives quickly recognize the telltale signs of a staged burglary. In a genuine burglary, the primary objective of the intruder is to locate and secure portable items of value, such as electronics, jewelry, or currency. Consequently, drawers are pulled out, closets are ransacked, and there is a general state of disruption throughout the dwelling. When a homicide occurs in a home that remains otherwise pristine, with valuable items left completely undisturbed, investigators immediately suspect that the burglary narrative is a fabrication. Furthermore, the point of entry is subjected to intense forensic scrutiny. A genuine intruder forces entry from the exterior of the home, leaving specific patterns of damage, such as wood splinters, paint flecks, and metal scrapes on the outside of the frame. When the structural damage indicates that the force was applied from the interior to the exterior, it reveals a breakout rather than a break-in. This crucial physical discrepancy immediately shifts the focus of the investigation inward, suggesting that the scene was altered after the fact by someone who already had legitimate access to the interior. Another vital dimension that investigators scrutinize is the timeline and the presence of physical alibis. Perpetrators often go to great lengths to establish a solid alibi by ensuring they are physically located in another city or state at the precise time the crime is estimated to have occurred. While this physical distance may initially satisfy superficial inquiries, it actually serves as a significant red flag when contrasted with other behavioral patterns. Criminologists note that the sudden, unexplained departure of a spouse just before a tragic event is a common occurrence in these cases. To counter this defense, law enforcement relies heavily on telecommunication records. In the modern era, every telephone call, message, and digital footprint leaves a permanent record. In the late 20th century, landline telephone bills and switching records provided a detailed map of interpersonal communication. By analyzing the timing, duration, and origin of telephone calls, investigators can establish conspiracies that transcend physical distance. For example, a brief phone call placed from the victim's residence to the alibi location, shortly after the estimated time of death, often serves as the silent signal that the deed has been completed, effectively linking the physical perpetrator to the distant mastermind. The psychological profile of the accomplice in these domestic conspiracies is equally revealing. Often, the mastermind does not possess the willingness to personally perform the act, or they recognize that doing so would place them under immediate suspicion. Therefore, they seek out an accomplice who is emotionally vulnerable, socially isolated, or deeply infatuated. This individual is often manipulated through false narratives of severe domestic abuse, imminent danger, or promises of a blissful future together once the obstacle is removed. The accomplice, acting under a misplaced sense of chivalry or romantic devotion, becomes a physical instrument of the mastermind's will. Criminology refers to such individuals as dupes because they bear the maximum physical and legal risk, while the mastermind attempts to remain completely insulated. The sophistication of these criminals is almost always an illusion. While they may successfully plan the physical aspects of the act, they invariably fail to manage the intense psychological pressure of a police investigation and their subsequent behaviors, such as engaging in premature romantic public displays or making sudden financial inquiries, quickly expose their guilt. To prevent such tragic cases, society must draw profound life lessons regarding interpersonal relationships and conflict resolution. Number 1. The importance of recognizing the warning signs of toxic and manipulative behavior cannot be overstated. When a relationship is characterized by chronic infidelity, secrecy, and a complete lack of mutual respect, the healthy and safe path forward is a clean legal separation. Individuals must understand that attempting to resolve personal and financial disputes through deception or violence is a path that leads to absolute destruction for all parties involved. Number 2, the community must foster a culture of transparency and support, where individuals feel safe to report domestic discord and seek professional counseling or legal aid. Number 3, Financial institutions and insurance companies must maintain rigorous oversight regarding sudden substantial increases in life insurance coverage, particularly when such changes are made without clear, logical justifications. By implementing strict verification processes, the financial incentive for these crimes can be significantly reduced. For law enforcement, the experiences gathered from these cases provide a valuable blueprint for accelerating future investigations. Officers can expedite the resolution of such cases by immediately implementing comprehensive background checks on the victim's immediate circle, preserving all digital and telecommunication data at the earliest stage, and conducting close physical and electronic surveillance of potential suspects immediately following the event. It is an observed truth in criminal justice that the behavior of suspects during the mourning period often reveals more than any initial interview. Furthermore, when dealing with multiple suspects, investigators should strategically exploit the psychological differences between the mastermind and the accomplice. By offering cooperation agreements to the individual who acted as the physical tool, prosecutors can secure the direct testimony necessary to convict the mastermind, who might otherwise remain protected by circumstantial ambiguity. The narrative of this specific case begins in the quiet suburban setting of North Little Rock, in the state of Arkansas, during the golden months of autumn, in the year 1988. It was a community where neighbors knew one another. Keys were sometimes exchanged for mutual assistance, and the peace of daily life was rarely disrupted by acts of violence. This tranquil environment was shattered on the morning of Saturday, October 22, 1988, when the local police department received a distressed telephone call from a resident named Esther Watts. She reported that she had made a deeply alarming discovery inside the residence of her neighbors, Roy and Debra Taylor. The sequence of events that led to this discovery began when Debra Taylor, who was temporarily out of town in Texarkana visiting her brother, contacted Esther Watts by telephone. Debra claimed that she was concerned. She had left an iron pressing machine active in her home and requested that Esther use her spare key to enter the residence and verify that the appliance was turned off. This request, while seemingly mundane, would prove to be the initial thread in a complex web of deception. Upon entering the Taylor residence, Esther Watts proceeded to the area where the appliance was located, only to find the unconscious form of Roy Taylor lying on the floor. In a state of intense shock and confusion, she contacted the local fire department, unable to determine if he was deceased or merely in need of urgent medical attention. The emergency dispatchers immediately routed the call to the North Little Rock Police Department, and a patrol officer was dispatched to the scene. Upon entering the home, the officer confirmed that Roy Taylor was indeed deceased, exhibiting clear signs of having sustained multiple injuries from a firearm. The officer immediately secured the perimeter, backed out of the residence, and initiated a formal homicide investigation. The victim, Roy Taylor, was a well-respected member of the community who served in the Arkansas National Guard and co-owned a successful swimming pool installation business with his wife, Debra. On the weekend of his demise, he had been preparing to attend his scheduled military drill. His military fatigues and boots were found carefully placed near his body, indicating that he was in the process of preparing for his service when he was confronted. He was dressed simply in a t-shirt and underwear, suggesting that the event occurred during the early morning hours or the very late evening of the previous day, which was Friday, October 21st, 1988. The preliminary examination of the crime scene yielded several critical forensic clues. The responding technicians recovered 3 projectiles from the floor, which were subsequently identified as belonging to a .38 caliber special firearm. The absence of spent shell casings at the scene immediately suggested to the experienced investigators that the weapon utilized was a revolver, which retains the empty casings within the cylinder after firing, unlike a semi-automatic handgun that automatically ejects them. This detail was significant, as it limited the search to a specific class of firearms and indicated a certain level of familiarity with weapons, or at least a deliberate choice of firearm by the perpetrator. As the detectives expanded their search of the physical structure, they encountered a major physical anomaly at the garage door. The doorframe exhibited signs of forced entry, with the wooden casing and molding cracked and broken, while the lock itself remained in the locked position. At first glance, this detail suggested that Roy Taylor might have interrupted a burglary in progress. However, as the detectives conducted a meticulous inventory of the home, they noted that absolutely nothing of value was missing. Electronic equipment, personal belongings, and other easily transportable items of wealth remained completely undisturbed. The drawers had not been searched, and there was no evidence of the systematic ransacking that characterizes a genuine burglary. The most damning piece of physical evidence, however, was revealed upon a closer inspection of the damaged garage door. A forensic analysis of the splintered wood and the direction of the force applied to the lock showed conclusively that the door had been forced open from the inside of the garage, rather than from the outside. It was a breakout, not a break-in. This discovery was a watershed moment for the investigation. It demonstrated that the killer had attempted to stage the scene to look like an external forced entry, but in their haste and lack of structural knowledge, they had applied the force in the wrong direction. The detectives now knew had absolute certainty that they were dealing with an inside job orchestrated by someone who had authorized access to the home and a strong personal or financial motive to eliminate Roy Taylor. To understand the potential motives, the police began a thorough exploration of Roy Taylor's life and background. He had been born and raised in the small, close-knit town of Belleville, Arkansas, where he grew up in a supportive family environment, enjoying traditional outdoor activities. His father, and learning to cook with his mother. As a young man, his charisma and handsome appearance made him highly attractive to others. He married his first wife, Brenda, in the early 1970s, and together they had 2 children. Roy was described as having an exceptional work ethic, often working night shifts and attending university classes during the day. He later joined the National Guard and secured employment at a Sears automotive center. However, despite his positive qualities, Roy possessed a wandering eye, and his frequent relationships with other women eventually led to the dissolution of his first marriage in the year 1973. Despite the divorce, Roy maintained a close and respectful relationship with Brenda and his children, living nearby and participating actively in their lives. He married a second time, but that union was brief and unsuccessful. By his late 20s, Roy had focused his energy on his career until he met Debra Bryans, a young woman from his hometown of Belleville. Debra was working at a local nursing home where Roy's aunt was a resident, and the two quickly formed a deep connection. They married in the year 1977 and subsequently built what appeared to many to be the quintessential American dream. They welcomed 2 sons into their lives and later adopted a daughter to complete their family. Together, Roy and Debra established a swimming pool business where Roy performed the demanding physical labor of installation and servicing, while Debra managed the office, handled the finances, and acted as the business administrator. The venture flourished, allowing them to purchase a beautiful home in an affluent neighborhood and enjoy a comfortable, successful lifestyle. To their neighbors and friends, they appeared to be an ideal, successful couple, deeply committed to their family and their business. However, beneath this polished exterior, serious domestic tensions were beginning to develop. When the news of Roy's passing reached his family, a relative contacted Debra in Texarkana on Saturday morning, informing her of the tragedy. Debra subsequently arranged for her children to remain in Texas and drove back to North Little Rock to meet with the investigators. During her initial interview, Debra appeared deeply distraught, expressing utter shock and claiming she had no knowledge of anyone who would wish to harm her husband. She painted a picture of a flawless marriage and a harmonious life, stating that her trip to Texarkana was planned simply because Roy was going to be occupied with his National Guard duties all weekend. Her brother in Texas confirmed her alibi, verifying that she was indeed at his residence during the time frame of the homicide. However, as investigators began interviewing Roy's friends and associates, a very different picture of his personal life began to emerge. It was revealed that Roy had continued to pursue extramarital relationships, and at the time of his death, he was actively seeing a girlfriend who was engaged to another man. This discovery initially provided a potential line of inquiry, as the fiancé of the girlfriend was considered a suspect with a potential motive of revenge. However, both the girlfriend and her fiancé were able to provide verified, airtight alibis for the night of the crime, leading detectives to eliminate them from suspicion. The investigators also looked into Roy's past relationships, including his ex-wives. While the second ex-wife was quickly ruled out, detectives learned of recent child support disagreements between Roy and his first wife, Brenda. When summoned to the police station, Brenda clarified that there was no bitter legal dispute and that they had actually maintained an amicable relationship since their divorce. More importantly, Brenda shared a poignant detail from a conversation she had with Roy approximately 2 weeks prior to his death. She described him as being unusually emotional, with tears running down his face, expressing a profound sense of feeling trapped in his current domestic life and unable to escape. This revelation stood in stark contrast to Debra's description of a perfect marriage, suggesting to the detectives that the domestic situation was far more volatile than Debra had admitted. With written consent from Debra, the police conducted a thorough search of the home and the financial records of the Taylor Pool Company. This search revealed a highly significant detail. The family's life insurance policies had been recently altered. While Roy already possessed $200,000 in standard coverage, along with a $50,000 policy through the National Guard, the records showed that an additional $300,000 of whole life insurance had been recently added to his name. This brought the total potential payout to over $500,000, with Debra Taylor designated as the sole beneficiary. The timing of this massive financial increase, occurring only a few months before Roy's sudden demise, immediately placed Debra at the center of the investigators' suspicions. A critical turning point in the investigation occurred during Roy's funeral services, which were held on October 26, 1988, in his hometown of Belleville. Attendees noted that Debra did not exhibit the expected behavior of a grieving widow. Of greater concern to the family and the detectives was the presence of a man named Henry Price, who accompanied Debra to the service. Henry Price was a longtime family friend who performed maintenance work on pool motors for the Taylor Pool Company. Observers noted that Debra's interactions with Henry appeared highly personal and inappropriate for a formal morning setting. Upon their return to North Little Rock, the police department placed Debra and Henry under physical surveillance. A dedicated team of 5 officers monitored their movements and tracked them to a local lodging establishment. The surveillance team obtained pay hat ote oguro, a pay hat evidence of the two spending a romantic night together and acting as an established couple. This discovery provided a clear connection between Debra and a potential accomplice, prompting detectives to deepen their investigation into Henry Price's background. The investigators interviewed Henry's estranged wife, Sherry Price, who provided crucial context regarding the relationship. Sherry revealed that she had discovered the extramarital relationship between Henry and Debra on October 1st, approximately 3 weeks prior to the homicide. She recounted a telephone conversation where Debra had informed Henry that the coast was clear, prompting Henry to leave his family to pursue his relationship with Debra. Sherry described Debra as a highly calculating and manipulative individual who possessed a strong influence over Henry, who was known to be a simple, socially awkward, and easily led man. Armed with this information, the detectives subpoenaed the telephone records for both the Taylor residence and Henry Price's phone. While the records showed numerous calls between the two in the preceding months, one specific call stood out. On the morning of Saturday, October 22nd, shortly after the estimated time of Roya's death, a brief telephone call was placed from the Taylor home landline to the residence of Debra's brother in Texarkana. Because Roy was already deceased at that time, and Debra was supposedly asleep in Texas, the detectives deduced that the physical perpetrator had placed this call to send a pre-arranged signal to Debra that the crime had been successfully executed. On the 10th day of the investigation, detectives summoned Henry Price to the police station for a formal interview. Initially, Henry attempted to portray his relationship with the Taylors as purely professional. However, when the investigators presented him with the surveillance photographs showing him with Debra at the motel, his resolve crumbled, and he began to speak openly. Henry revealed that Debra had convinced him that Roy was highly abusive, even showing him a physical bruise as evidence. Furthermore, she had led Henry to believe that Roy had discovered their relationship and was actively planning to take Henry's life. Henry confessed that they had developed a plan to eliminate Roy. The plan involved Debra traveling to Texas to establish an alibi, while Henry would use a key provided by Debra to enter the home and wait for Roy's return. Henry admitted to stealing a .38 caliber revolver from his brother-in-law, parking his vehicle at a distance, and walking through a trail to access the residence. When Roy entered the home, preparing for his National Guard duties, Henry confronted him and fired multiple times, causing his immediate demise. Henry also confirmed the significance of the telephone call from the Taylor residence. He admitted that he had placed the call to Debra's alibi location as part of a prearranged code. The specific phrase used to signal the completion of the act was that she needed to purchase a black dress. Following the call, Henry attempted to stage the scene as a burglary by forcing the garage door lock from the inside before disassembling the weapon, drilling out the barrel to prevent ballistic identification, and disposing of the components in the Arkansas River. With Henry's complete confession in hand, the police prepared to arrest Debra. However, before they could act, Debra contacted the department, having been alerted by Henry that the police were questioning him. Eager to manage the situation, Debra arrived at the Detective Bureau and attempted to utilize her natural charm and manipulative tendencies to redirect the investigation. However, her demeanor changed completely when the detectives informed her that Henry had already confessed and detailed her role as the mastermind of the conspiracy. Debra attempted to minimize her involvement, claiming that her discussions with Henry regarding Roy's demise were merely light-hearted jokes and that she had never intended for him to take physical action. She suggested that Henry was a simple man who had misinterpreted her words and acted entirely on his own initiative. She repeated her allegations of severe abuse at the hands of Roy, claiming she felt trapped in the marriage because Roy had stated he would never allow her to leave. The prosecutors, recognizing the challenges of presenting a purely circumstantial case against a manipulative defendant, offered Henry Price a plea agreement of 40 years imprisonment in exchange for his truthful testimony at Debra's trial. This strategic decision ensured that the jury would hear direct first-hand testimony regarding the conspiracy. 7 months after the tragedy, Debra Taylor stood trial for her role in the planning and execution of her husband's demise. During the trial, Debra maintained a highly demure, religious appearance, carrying a Bible and presenting herself as an innocent victim of circumstances. However, the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Henry Price took the stand and testified in detail about how Debra had manipulated his emotions, convinced him that his life was in danger, and directed him to perform the physical act while she secured an alibi. Despite the betrayal, Henry admitted under cross-examination that he had been deeply in love with Debra and had acted out of a desire to protect her. Debra also took the stand in her own defense, presenting a detailed narrative of the abuse she alleged she had suffered. However, her cold and calculated demeanor during her testimony failed to convince the jury. After a trial that exposed the depth of the deception, the jury deliberated for only 50 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty, sentencing Debra Taylor to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The resolution of this case stands as a testament to the meticulous work of the North Little Rock Police Department and the power of forensic science to expose lies. The tragedy of Roy Taylor's passing serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of greed and manipulation within relationships, and the enduring truth that justice, though sometimes delayed, will ultimately prevail. The study of domestic transgressions reveals a recurring pattern wherein individuals attempt to resolve complex personal and financial dilemmas through extreme actions, mistakenly believing they can outsmart the collective wisdom of law enforcement. These cases are unfortunately frequent because the perpetrators often suffer from an illusion of unique intelligence, believing that their personal charm, a carefully constructed alibi, or the manipulation of a third party will shield them from the consequences of their actions. In reality, the pursuit of quick wealth, combined with the breakdown of marital trust, creates a volatile mix that leads to tragic outcomes. The case of Roy Taylor, which unfolded in North Little Rock, Arkansas, in the late 1980s, serves as a textbook example of hot kep physical evidence inevitably exposes the flaws in a planned conspiracy. When investigators arrived at the quiet suburban home on that fateful October morning, they were presented with a scene designed to mimic a burglary. However, the physical reality of the scene immediately contradicted the narrative of an external intruder. The garage door showed signs of forced entry, but upon closer inspection, the damage had clearly been inflicted from the inside out. The lock remained engaged, and the splintered wood indicated a force applied from within the residence. This fundamental physical contradiction is vekep hatate investigators call a staged scene. A genuine burglar does not break out of a locked home, while leaving valuable electronic equipment and personal belongings completely untouched. The mild irony of this loophole lies in the fact that the perpetrator, in their desperation to create a false trail, left behind the very evidence that proved the crime was an inside job. Furthermore, the absence of spent shell casings at the crime scene provided another vital clue. Semi-automatic firearms eject their casings upon firing, leaving physical markers that can be easily recovered. The absence of etuje hat casings pointed directly to the use of a revolver, where the spent casings remain within the cylinder after the projectiles are fired. This simple physical detail allowed the police to narrow their search to a specific class of firearm, specifically a .38 caliber revolver. The meticulous examination of the victim's body also revealed defensive wounds on his left forearm, demonstrating that he had perceived the threat and attempted to protect himself. This disproved any theory of a sudden, unperceived accident and established that the act was a deliberate, close-range assault. The financial dimension of the case offered an even more compelling trail. The sudden and significant escalation of Roy Taylor's life insurance coverage, which reached an aggregate of over $500,000 just months before his death, immediately drew the suspicion of the investigating team. Legitimate financial planning is a gradual process, and such a dramatic increase in coverage, with the spouse designated as the sole beneficiary, is a classic red flag in forensic accounting. The paper trail created by these financial adjustments provided a clear and undeniable motive, linking the administrative head of the household directly to the tragedy. The sophistication of the crime, or rather the lack thereof, is further highlighted by the interpersonal dynamics of the co-conspirators. The primary perpetrator, Debra Taylor, sought to distance herself from the physical act by exploiting the loyalty of a local technician, Henry Price. Henry was described by those who knew him as a simple, socially awkward individual who was easily influenced. By presenting herself as a victim of domestic distress and fabrications, Debra managed to manipulate Henry into believing that executing her husband was an act of protection rather than a cold-blooded crime for financial gain. This dynamic illustrates the profound danger of emotional manipulation, where a dominant personality can bend another to their will, leading both down a path of mutual destruction. The North Little Rock Police Department demonstrated exceptional patience and analytical skill throughout the investigation. Rather than rushing to make an arrest based on initial suspicion, the detectives allowed the perpetrators to expose themselves through their own actions. By placing the suspects under surveillance, the police gathered photographic evidence of Debra and Henry behaving as a romantic couple at a local motel shortly after the funeral. This inappropriate behavior, contrasting sharply with the expected demeanor of a grieving widow, shattered any remaining credibility Debra possessed. When confronted vekep hat this objective photographic evidence, the fragile alliance between the co-conspirators began to crumble. Henry Price, realizing the depth of the deception and the inevitability of his situation, provided a full confession detailing the key provided by Debra, the execution of the crime, and the coded telephone call instructing her to purchase a black dress. The lessons to be drawn from this tragedy are both profound and universal. First and foremost, the case highlights the destructive nature of greed and the absolute necessity of open, honest communication in personal relationships. When a marriage deteriorates, the civilized resolution is always separation or divorce, rather than the pursuit of financial windfall through violence. The tragedy also warns the community about the dangers of unchecked manipulation. Individuals must remain vigilant against attempts by others to exploit their emotions, and they must always seek independent verification before acting on dramatic claims of distress. For law enforcement, the successful resolution of this case underscores the importance of combining physical forensic analysis with behavioral profiling and financial auditing. By refusing to accept the staged burglary at face value and digging deeper into the financial and personal lives of those involved, the detectives were able to reconstruct the truth. Speeding up such investigations in the future relies heavily on the rapid integration of digital and physical surveillance, immediate forensic accounting, and strong community outreach to gather timely intelligence from neighbors and associates. To fully understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must look back to the quiet community of North Little Rock, Arkansas, on Saturday, October 22, 1988. It was just after 10 o'clock in the morning when the police department received a panicked phone call from a local resident named Esther Watts. Esther explained to the dispatcher that she was assisting her neighbors, Debra and Roy Taylor, by checking on their residence while Debra was out of town. The neighbors had a long-standing arrangement where they held keys to each other's homes to help in times of need or to perform simple domestic tasks. Debra had traveled to Texarkana to visit her brother, leaving her husband Roy behind for the weekend. According to Esther, Debra had called her from Texarkana, expressing concern that she might have left an iron-pressing machine running in the house. She requested that Esther step next door to verify that everything was secure. When Esther unlocked the door and stepped inside to locate the appliance, she made a shocking discovery. Roy Taylor was lying motionless on the floor, dressed only in his underwear and a t-shirt. Near his body were his National Guard fatigues and boots, laid out in preparation for his weekend drill. An officer from the North Little Rock Police Department arrived at the scene shortly after the call and entered the residence. It was immediately apparent that Roy Taylor was deceased, having sustained multiple injuries from a firearm. The initial examination showed that he had been shot several times at close range. The responding officer secured the area and called in the homicide detectives to begin their investigation. The medical examiner later estimated that the time of death was either late in the evening of Friday, October 21st, or early in the morning of Saturday, October 22, 1988. At the scene, the detectives recovered 3 projectiles from the floor, which appeared to be from a .38 caliber revolver. The absence of spent shell casings supported the theory that a revolver was used, as these firearms retain the casings within the cylinder after firing. As the detectives conducted a thorough search of the home, they noticed that the house was remarkably orderly. There were no ransacked drawers, no overturned furniture, and no valuable personal belongings or electronic equipment were missing. The only sign of disruption was at the garage door. The garage door molding and casing were cracked and broken, yet the lock remained in the secured position. Upon close inspection, the forensic team determined that the door had been forced from the inside out, rather than from the exterior. This crucial observation suggested that the damage was staged after the crime had occurred, in an attempt to make the scene resemble a forced entry by an intruder. It became clear to the detectives that they were dealing with a perpetrator who had intimate knowledge of the home and a strong personal motive. As standard procedure, the police began by interviewing neighbors and friends to piece together the life of Roy Taylor. Roy had been born and raised in the small town of Belleville, Arkansas, where he grew up in a close-knit and supportive family. He was described by those who knew him as a charismatic, hard-working, and highly attractive young man. In college, he had balanced a demanding work schedule with his studies, showing an admirable work ethic that stayed with him throughout his life. He later joined the National Guard and secured employment at a Sears automotive store. During his college years, Roy met his first wife, Brenda. The couple married and had 2 children together. While Roy was a dedicated provider, his personal life was complicated by what friends described as an active interest in other women. His inability to remain faithful eventually led to the dissolution of his first marriage, resulting in a divorce in 1973. Despite the separation, Roy remained an active father, maintaining a residence close to Brenda and the children, and spending weekends with them. Following a brief second marriage that also ended in divorce, Roy focused on his career. In the late 1970s, he met 19-year-old Debra Bryans while visiting a relative at a nursing home where she worked. The two fell in love and were married in 1977. The couple went on to have 2 sons and later adopted a daughter, completing what many in the community viewed as an ideal family. Together, Roy and Debra established a highly successful pool installation and service business. Roy managed the physical labor in the field, while Debra operated the office and handled the financial records. The business thrived, allowing the family to purchase a beautiful home in an affluent neighborhood and enjoy a comfortable lifestyle. However, as detectives dug deeper into the family's background, they discovered that the marriage was far from perfect. Roy had continued his pattern of extramarital relationships, a fact that was well known among his close circle of friends. One individual informed the police that Roy had been seeing a woman who was engaged to another man, though both the woman and her fiancé were quickly ruled out as suspects after providing verified alibis. Detectives also looked into Roy's first wife, Brenda, due to recent discussions regarding child support. However, Brenda cooperated fully and explained that their relationship had remained amicable after the divorce. She shared a poignant memory of a conversation with Roy just 2 weeks before his death, where he had appeared uncharacteristically emotional and expressed a feeling of being trapped in his current situation, stating that he could not find a way out. This suggested to the detectives that the tension within the Taylor household was reaching a critical point. With Debra Taylor returning from Texarkana after receiving the news of her husband's death, detectives conducted a formal interview. Debra appeared deeply distraught and maintained that she had a picture-perfect marriage. She explained that she had traveled to Texas with the children because Roy was scheduled for National Guard duty all weekend, and she did not wish to remain home alone. Her brother confirmed her alibi, verifying that she was indeed in Texarkana at the time of the shooting. The investigation took a significant turn when detectives obtained written consent to review the financial records of the Taylor Pool Company and the family's personal accounts. The forensic audit revealed that Roy's life insurance policies had recently undergone substantial modifications. In addition to a $50,000 policy through the National Guard, the family had recently increased Roy's personal life insurance coverage to over $500,000. This massive increase, completed just months prior to the incident, placed Debra in a position to receive a significant financial windfall upon her husband's death, immediately making her a primary person of interest. The suspicion surrounding Debra intensified during Roy's funeral in Belleville. Attendees noted that her behavior did not align with that of a grieving widow. Of particular concern was her close association with a man named Henry Price, who had accompanied her to the services. Henry had known the Taylors for over a decade and had performed contract work for their pool company. Upon their return to North Little Rock, the police initiated a surveillance operation to monitor the activities of Debra and Henry. The surveillance team followed the pair to a local motel where they documented the two spending a romantic evening together. This observation led detectives to interview Henry's estranged wife, Sherry. Sherry revealed that she had discovered her husband was having an affair with Debra Duette 3 weeks prior to the homicide. She recounted a phone call where Debra had informed Henry that the coast was clear, prompting a confrontation that led to the breakdown of their own marriage. Armed with this information, detectives subpoenaed the telephone records for both the Taylor residence and Henry Price. The records showed an extraordinary volume of communication between the two in the months leading up to the crime. Crucially, the records also revealed a brief outgoing call made from the Taylor home to Debra's brother's residence in Texarkana on the morning of Saturday, October 22nd, shortly after the estimated time of Roy's death. This call, which had not been mentioned by Debra, suggested that someone was present in the home after the shooting and had immediately contacted her. The detectives decided to bring Henry Price in for questioning. During the interview, investigators presented Henry with the photographic evidence of his relationship with Debra. Realizing the strength of the case against him, Henry began to cooperate. He painted a picture of a complex manipulation, explaining that Debra had convinced him that Roy was physically abusive and posed a threat to her safety. Henry believed that Roy was actively seeking to harm him as well, creating a sense of urgency that drove them to plot the homicide. Henry confessed that they had discussed several plans to eliminate Roy. Ultimately, they decided that Henry would enter the home using a key provided by Debra while she was away in Texarkana, establishing her alibi. On the morning of the incident, Henry entered the residence and waited. When Roy returned to prepare for his National Guard drill, Henry confronted him and fired the fatal shots. Following the act, Henry staged the forced entry on the garage door, disassembled the weapon, and discarded it in the Arkansas River. He also admitted to making the brief phone call to Texarkana. The call was a prearranged signal to let Debra know the task was complete, using the coded phrase instructing her to purchase a black dress. With Henry's detailed confession, the police prepared to arrest Debra. However, before they could act, Debra contacted the department, having been alerted by Henry that the investigators were questioning him. When Debra arrived at the police station, she attempted to maintain her innocence, suggesting that Henry had acted independently and had misinterpreted their casual, joking conversations about wishing Roy was no longer around. She denied any direct involvement in the planning or execution of the crime, claiming that Henry S.'s actions were entirely his own. However, the accumulation of physical evidence, the financial records, the telephone logs, and Henry S.'s detailed testimony provided a compelling case for the prosecution. Both Debra Taylor and Henry Price were charged verkep tahat capital murder. To ensure a successful conviction and avoid the risk of a hung jury, the prosecution offered Henry Price a plea agreement of 40 years in exchange for his truthful testimony at Debra's trial. In May of 1989, 7 months after the tragedy, Debra Taylor went on trial for her role in the planning and execution of her husband's death. During the trial, the prosecution presented a powerful case detailing the financial motivation, the extramarital affair, and the elaborate planning that went into the crime. Henry Price took the stand as the key witness, testifying to his deep affection for Debra and his belief that he was protecting her from an abusive husband, despite the lack of any official reports or corroborating evidence of such abuse. He explained that he had been completely manipulated by Debra, who had orchestrated every detail of the plan. In a surprising legal strategy, the defense chose to place Debra on the stand. She delivered a detailed and articulate testimony, repeating her allegations of domestic distress and asserting that she had no knowledge of Henry S.'s intentions. Despite her composed and demure demeanor in the courtroom, the physical and circumstantial evidence proved overwhelming. The jury deliberated for diuete 50 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty. Debra Taylor was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The resolution of this tragic case brought a sense of justice to the family of Roy Taylor and the community of North Little Rock. It highlighted the meticulous and dedicated efforts of the law enforcement officers who looked beyond the superficial staging of a crime scene to uncover the complex web of deceit, greed, and manipulation that lay beneath. The story remains a powerful reminder of the inevitable consequences of unlawful actions and the enduring strength of truth and justice in the face of human tragedy. In the quiet, orderly suburbs of North Little Rock, Arkansas, the autumn of 1988 brought with it a crisp chill and the peaceful routine of a community where neighbors knew one another and shared a deep sense of mutual trust. It was a place where keys were exchanged for safekeeping, and help was always just a phone call away. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, a complex web of deceit, greed, and manipulation was quietly weaving its threads, culminating in a tragedy that would shatter the peace of the neighborhood and leave seasoned investigators grappling with a chillingly calculated crime. The date was Saturday, October 22nd, 1988, just after 10 o'clock in the morning, when the silence of the suburban enclave was broken by a panicked emergency call. Esther Watts, a well-meaning and reliable neighbor, had made a discovery that no one could have anticipated. She had been asked by her neighbor, Debra Taylor, to check on the Taylor household. Debra, who was out of town in the city of Texarkana visiting her brother, had called Esther with a seemingly mundane concern, explaining that she was worried she might have left her industrial iron pressing machine running and desperately needed someone to ensure it did not cause a fire. The relationship between the two households was close enough that they routinely held keys to each other. S homes, a testament to the safety and warmth they believed defined their lives. When Esther entered the residence to perform this simple favor, she walked into a silent house that immediately felt unsettling. Seeking the pressing machine, her eyes instead fell upon the motionless form of Roy Taylor, lying on the floor in his underwear and a light shirt. He was completely unresponsive, Overwhelmed by shock and unable to comprehend the reality of what she was seeing, Esther immediately contacted the local fire department, hoping against hope that it was merely a medical emergency and that help could still arrive in time. The emergency responders quickly recognized that the situation was far more grave than a sudden illness, and immediately requested the presence of the North Little Rock Police Department. When the patrol officers arrived and secured the perimeter, they stepped into a scene that was both tragic and highly perplexing. Roy Taylor was clearly deceased, and even a preliminary examination made it evident that he had been the victim of a violent assault, having been struck multiple times by gunfire. The physical evidence at the scene painted a picture of a sudden, close-range attack. Near his body lay his military fatigues and boots, carefully laid out in preparation for his weekend drills with the National Guard, a duty he took pride in and was scheduled to attend that very morning. The contrast between his dedication to service and the quiet finality of his end was stark. As the detectives began their meticulous processing of the home, they noted the complete absence of spent shell casings on the floor, though they did recover 3 distinct projectiles. This detail was a vital early clue for the investigators. In the world of forensic ballistics, the absence of ejected casings strongly points toward the use of a revolver, a firearm that retains its spent casings within the cylinder after firing, unlike a semi-automatic weapon which mechanically ejects them. This suggested a perpetrator who was either disciplined enough to collect their casings or, more likely, was utilizing a classic 5-shot or 6-shot revolver. The lack of random chaos in the house also stood out. In a standard, chaotic burglary, one would expect to see drawers pulled open, valuables hastily grabbed, electronics disconnected, and personal belongings scattered in a desperate search for cash or jewelry. Here, however, nothing of value had been disturbed. The television, the recording equipment, and the personal papers remained exactly where they belonged. The only physical anomaly in the entire structure was the garage door, which showed clear signs of structural damage. The molding and casing around the frame were cracked and broken, yet the lock itself remained firmly engaged in the locked position. This single, damaged door became the focal point of the initial physical analysis. At first glance, it might have appeared to be the entry point of a desperate intruder who had been interrupted by the homeowner. However, seasoned investigators are trained to look past first impressions and analyze the physical forces at play. A closer inspection of the splintered wood and the direction of the force revealed a highly unusual and telling detail. The door had not been forced open from the outside in an attempt to gain entry. Rather, the wood had been splintered by a heavy force applied from the inside, pushing outward. It was not a break-in at all, but rather a staged breakout. This structural detail was a clear revelation to the detectives. It indicated that the individual responsible for the crime had already been inside the home, had carried out the deed, and had then deliberately damaged the garage door from the inside before leaving, in a clumsy and desperate attempt to make the scene resemble a burglary gone wrong. This structural anomaly suggested a high degree of premeditated deception, but it also highlighted a fundamental loophole in the criminal logic. By trying too hard to create a false narrative, the perpetrator had left behind a glaring physical contradiction that pointed directly to an inside job or a killer who had free access to the home. The big question for law enforcement was no longer just who had entered the home, but who had possessed the keys, the access, and the intimate knowledge of the victim's schedule to execute such an act, and then attempt to cover it up so deliberately. To understand the motive behind such a tragedy, the investigators began to piece together the life and history of Roy Taylor. Born and raised in the small, close-knit community of Belleville, Arkansas, Roy had grown up surrounded by the traditional values of a loving family. He was a charismatic, handsome young man with striking blue eyes and an easygoing personality that drew people to him effortlessly. During his college years, his charm had won the heart of his first wife, Brenda. The two had built a life together, and Roy had demonstrated a remarkable work ethic, balancing late-night shifts with early morning college classes, eventually joining the National Guard and securing stable employment in the automotive division of a major retail chain. Together, they had welcomed 2 children and appeared to be building a stable, happy future. However, as the years passed, Roy's charismatic nature and a self-admitted inability to remain faithful began to erode the foundations of his marriage. His first wife would later candidly note that Roy had a profound affection for the company of women, a weakness that ultimately led to the dissolution of their marriage in 1973. Despite the divorce, Roy remained a dedicated father, maintaining a close relationship with his children and living only a short distance away to ensure he could remain an active part of their lives. A second marriage followed, but it too was brief, lasting only a short time before Roy once again found himself single, focusing primarily on his career and his service. It was during a visit to see a relative at a local care facility in his hometown of Belleville that Roy met a young, 19-year-old woman named Debra Bryans. Debra was working at the facility, and her reputation was that of a hard-working, family-oriented individual who would do anything for those she cared about. Despite the 9-year age difference, the 28-year-old Roy was instantly captivated by her, and the feeling was entirely mutual. After a courtship of a little over a year, the couple married in 1977. Over the next decade, they appeared to build a highly successful and enviable life together. They welcomed 2 sons, and because Debra desperately wished for a daughter, they eventually opened their hearts and home to adopt a young girl, completing what many in their social circle viewed as the quintessential American dream family. Together, they enjoyed outdoor activities, taking their children on fishing and hunting trips, and participating actively in their suburban neighborhood. Their professional lives were equally prosperous. They established the Taylor Pool Company, a business dedicated to installing and servicing swimming pools. The division of labor within the company was highly effective. Roy, with his physical strength and technical expertise, managed the demanding field operations, working directly with clients and performing the manual installation. Debra, on the other hand, managed the administrative side of the business, serving as the office manager, handling the finances, scheduling, and client records. This business success allowed them to afford a beautiful home in an affluent neighborhood, reinforcing the public perception of a perfectly happy, unified, and successful partnership. Yet, as the investigators began to dig beneath this polished exterior, they quickly discovered that the picture-perfect marriage was far more fragile than it appeared. When a married individual becomes the victim of a homicide, standard investigative protocol dictates that the surviving spouse must be carefully interviewed and evaluated, as statistics and experience show that domestic complications are frequently at the heart of such tragedies. However, in this case, Debra Taylor possessed a highly compelling alibi. At the time of the shooting, she was miles away in the city of Texarkana, accompanied by her children and her brother, who firmly verified her presence. Upon receiving the devastating news of her husband S. passing on Saturday morning, she had immediately arranged for her children's care and driven back to Little Rock to meet with the detectives. In her initial interviews, Debra appeared utterly distraught, presenting herself as a grieving widow who could not comprehend why anyone would want to harm her husband. She insisted that their marriage was harmonious and devoid of conflict. But the autopsy, completed on Monday, October 24th, began to tell a different story. The medical examiner's report indicated that Roy had sustained a defensive wound to his left forearm, which had entered and exited the limb before striking his chest, alongside another wound to his right shoulder from behind. Gunpowder residue on his lower back and arm indicated that the weapon had been discharged at very close range. This suggested that Roy had been aware of his attacker's presence, raising his arm in a desperate, instinctive attempt to shield himself from the incoming fire. The focus of the investigation soon shifted to the hidden complexities of Roy's personal life. The detectives quickly learned from Roy's close friends and associates that his old habits of infidelity had not entirely vanished. He had been quietly involved in an extramarital affair with a young woman who was currently engaged to another man. This discovery provided an immediate and plausible theory. Perhaps an outraged and jealous fiancé had discovered the relationship and sought a violent resolution. However, when detectives located and interviewed both the girlfriend and her fiancé, they were able to present solid, verifiable alibis that completely eliminated them as suspects. The investigators also reached out to Roy's first wife, Brenda, to determine if any lingering disputes over child support or custody could have escalated. Brenda was entirely cooperative, explaining that while there had been routine court appearances to finalize child support adjustments, their post-divorce relationship was remarkably amicable and entirely free of bitterness. However, Brenda provided the detectives with a highly significant psychological detail. She recalled a conversation with Roy just 2 weeks prior to his death. During a quiet moment at her kitchen table, a rare tear had rolled down Roy's face. When she asked him what was wrong and suggested that perhaps things were difficult at home, he had looked at her with a profound sense of resignation and admitted that he felt completely trapped, stating simply that he could not get out of his current situation. This poignant revelation directly contradicted Debra's description of a flawless, happy marriage and suggested that Roy was living under an immense amount of personal stress and dread. With this new perspective, the detectives returned to the financial and business records of the Taylor Pool Company, securing written consent from Debra to conduct a thorough search. It was here that they uncovered a massive, unmistakable motive. A detailed review of Roy's life insurance portfolio revealed that in the months leading up to his death, substantial modifications had been made to his coverage. In addition to an existing $200,000 policy and a $50,000 policy associated with his service in the National Guard, an additional $300,000 of coverage had been recently secured. This brought the total value of the insurance payout upon his death to over $500,000, a staggering sum in the late 1980s. While Debra maintained that these financial adjustments were entirely Roy's idea, viewing whole life insurance as a sound investment strategy, the timing and the sheer volume of the coverage immediately raised massive red flags for the seasoned investigators. In any homicide investigation, A sudden and substantial increase in a life insurance policy prior to a suspicious death automatically positions the primary beneficiary as a key person of interest, regardless of how robust their physical alibi might initially appear. The suspicions surrounding Debra Taylor intensified during Roy's funeral, held in his small hometown of Belleville on October 26th. Attendees and family members quietly contacted the police to report that Debra did not behave in a manner consistent with a deeply grieving spouse. More alarmingly, she arrived at the services accompanied by a man named Henry Price, behaving with a level of familiarity and affection that struck many as highly inappropriate for the solemn occasion. Henry Price was not a stranger to the family. He was a local mechanic who had known the Taylors for over a decade and frequently performed maintenance work on pool motors for the Taylor Pool Company. Because Roy spent the vast majority of his time out in the field doing physical installations, Debra had run the office alone, providing ample opportunity for her and Henry to interact in private. Upon their return to North Little Rock, the police department placed Debra and Henry under active physical surveillance. A dedicated team of investigators shadowed their movements, eventually following them to a local lodging establishment, the Waukesha Inn. There, detectives observed and photographed the couple behaving in an unmistakably romantic manner, confirming without a doubt that they were involved in an active, intimate relationship. To gather more information on Henry Price, the detectives interviewed his estranged wife, Sherry. Sherry was candid and cooperative, revealing that she had discovered the affair on October 1st, just 3 weeks before the murder. She had overheard a telephone conversation in which Debra informed Henry that the coast was clear, prompting an immediate confrontation. When Sherry demanded that Henry choose between his family and his relationship with Debra, Henry had chosen Debra and moved out of the family home. While this established a clear romantic and personal connection, the detectives still lacked direct physical evidence linking Henry to the crime scene on the night of the shooting. To bridge this gap, they turned to a meticulous analysis of the telephone records for both the Taylor residence and Henry Price home. The records revealed an intense volume of communication between the two phones in the months leading up to the tragedy. However, one specific call stood out as incredibly suspicious. On the morning of Saturday, October 22nd, shortly after the estimated time of Roy S.'s death, but before his body was officially discovered by the neighbor, a very brief call had been placed from the Taylor home phone to the residence of Debra S. brother in Texarkana. Because Roy was already deceased at this time, the call had to have been placed by the killer. This was a critical piece of circumstantial evidence. It suggested that the perpetrator had used the landline immediately after committing the act to transmit a direct signal to Debra, confirming that the plan had been successfully executed. Armed with this compelling chronological evidence and the surveillance photographs, the detectives subpoenaed Henry Price to the station for an interview. Initially, Henry attempted to maintain a professional facade, describing his relationship with the Taylors as purely business-oriented. However, when the investigators confronted him with the photographic evidence of his romantic trysts with Debra at the motel, Henry's composure crumbled. Recognizing that his position was untenable, he began to speak, opening a floodgate of startling revelations. Henry explained that he had fallen deeply under Debra's influence. Over the preceding months, Debra had systematically painted a picture of herself as a victim of severe physical abuse, even showing him physical marks that she claimed were inflicted by Roy. She had also convinced Henry that Roy had discovered their relationship and was actively planning to take Henriette's life. By weaponizing Henriette's protective instincts and his deep affection for her, Debra had convinced him that the only way to ensure her safety and their future together was to eliminate Roy entirely. Together, they had meticulously planned the crime. Debra had provided Henry with a key to the house and arranged her trip to Texarkana to establish a flawless alibi. Henry had obtained a .38 caliber revolver from his brother-in-law to ensure the weapon could not be traced back to him. On the night of the crime, he parked his vehicle a safe distance away, approached the house via a secluded trail, and used the key to gain entry. He lay in wait until Roy arrived home to prepare for his National Guard duty, and then carried out the shooting. Following the act, Henry placed the pre-arranged telephone call to Texarkana, delivering the coded phrase, "You need to buy a black dress," signaling to Debra that she was now a wealthy widow. To complete the deception, he forced the garage door from the inside out to mimic a burglary, dismantled the firearm, drilled out the barrel to destroy the ballistics footprint, and discarded the pieces into the deep waters of the Arkansas River. Henry's detailed confession was the breakthrough the police needed, but before they could act on it, Debra herself contacted the department. Henry had managed to place a brief call to her, warning her that the police were questioning him. In a calculated effort to regain control of the situation and manipulate the investigators, Debra arrived at the station, presenting herself in an unusually confident and casual manner. However, her confidence vanished when the detectives informed her that Henry had fully confessed and laid bare the entire conspiracy. Faced with this reality, Debra quickly pivoted, attempting to minimize her involvement. She admitted that she and Henry had engaged in what she characterized as light-hearted, joking conversations about wishing Roy would suffer a medical event or a hunting accident. But she insisted she had never been serious. She claimed that Henry was a simple, impressionable man who had completely misinterpreted her venting and had acted entirely on his own initiative. She denied any active role in the planning or execution of the crime, casting herself as an innocent bystander to Henriette's impulsive violence. The investigators, however, were entirely unconvinced by her performance. The paper trail of the newly secured $500,000 life insurance policies, combined with the precise timing of her trip to Texarkana and the coded telephone call, made it clear that Debra was the mastermind and the driving force behind the entire plot. She had deliberately seduced and manipulated Henry, using him as a physical tool to secure a massive financial payout, the family home, and the sole ownership of the pool business, without the complications of a divorce. Both Debra Taylor and Henry Price were subsequently arrested and charged with capital murder. To ensure a guaranteed conviction and avoid the risk of a hung jury, prosecutors offered Henry a plea agreement of 40 years in exchange for his truthful testimony against Debra at her trial. In May of 1989, 7 months after the tragedy, Debra Taylor stood trial. Throughout the proceedings, she attempted to project an image of a demure, traditional, and religious woman, even carrying a Bible into the courtroom to garner sympathy. Henry Price took the stand as the prosecution's star witness, delivering emotional and devastating testimony. He admitted his guilt, but insisted that he had acted solely out of a desperate, manipulated belief that he was protecting the woman he loved from a dangerous abuser, famously stating that while he would never kill to possess her, he had killed to protect her. When the defense took the unusual step of putting Debra on the stand, She delivered a highly detailed, coherent narrative of alleged abuse, but her cold, detached demeanor under cross-examination failed to sway the jury. After a brief deliberation of only 50 minutes, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, sentencing Debra Taylor to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This tragic case offers profound and enduring lessons for Bayou Tehat communities and law enforcement. It highlights the devastating real-world consequences of greed and deceit, showing how easily individuals can be manipulated when they allow their emotions to blind them to basic moral principles. For the community, it serves as a powerful reminder that the appearance of a perfect life can often mask deep personal struggles, and that open communication and vigilance are essential to preventing domestic escalation. For law enforcement, the successful resolution of this case underscores the vital importance of thorough physical evidence analysis, such as identifying the physics of a staged break-in and the indispensable value of financial and telephonic forensics. By combining traditional street-level surveillance with meticulous documentation, the police were able to dismantle a sophisticated conspiracy and ensure that justice was served, honoring the memory of the victim and reinforcing the eternal truth that the truth will ultimately come to light. The quiet suburban streets of Little Rock, Arkansas, have long been associated with peace, community, and the comforting predictability of daily life. In the late autumn of 1988, the residents of this close-knit neighborhood went about their routines with a sense of security that had been built over decades of shared history and mutual trust. It was a place where neighbors held keys to each other. Homes watched over one another's children and offered help without hesitation. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, a complex web of human emotion, financial pressure, and personal secrets was quietly spinning itself into a tragedy that would forever alter the lives of those involved and leave a lasting mark on the community. The unfolding of this tragic event began on a Saturday morning, specifically on October 22, 1988. It was just after 10 o'clock in the morning when the peaceful silence of the neighborhood was shattered by a panicked telephone call to the local emergency services. The call came from a woman named Esther Watts, a resident of the community who was known for her helpful and neighborly nature. Esther had been asked by her neighbor, Debra Taylor, to check on the Taylor residence. Debra was currently out of town, having traveled to Texarkana with her children to visit her brother. Before leaving, Debra had expressed concern that she might have left an iron pressing machine turned on in her home, which presented a potential fire hazard. Because the neighbors shared keys to each other's houses for emergencies, Esther readily agreed to walk over and verify that everything was safe. As Esther unlocked the door and stepped inside the Taylor residence, the quietness of the house seemed ordinary at first, however. As she made her way through the home to locate the pressing machine, she made a sudden and alarming discovery. Lying on the floor was Roy Taylor, Debra's husband. He was dressed in undergarments and a T-shirt, appearing completely motionless. In her initial shock and confusion, Esther was unable to determine whether Roy was unconscious or had passed away. Realizing the urgency of the situation, she immediately contacted the fire department, seeking medical assistance for her neighbor. When the emergency medical responders arrived at the scene, they quickly realized that they were dealing with a situation that went far beyond a medical emergency. They immediately summoned the North Little Rock Police Department. A patrol officer from the North Little Rock Police Department was the first to enter the home. Upon approaching the body of Roy Taylor, the officer noted that the man was clearly deceased. It was immediately apparent from the initial examination of the scene that Roy had been shot multiple times. The officer carefully backed out of the residence to preserve the integrity of the scene and officially called in the case as a homicide. The sudden transformation of a quiet suburban home into a crime scene marked the beginning of a highly meticulous and complex investigation that would challenge the experienced detectives of the local department. The initial physical examination of the scene revealed several key details about the circumstances surrounding the death of Roy Taylor. Roy was a dedicated member of the Arkansas National Guard, and on that particular weekend, he had been preparing to attend a scheduled drill. His military fatigues and boots were placed neatly near his body, indicating that he had been getting ready to dress for duty when his life was abruptly ended. Based on the condition of the body and the physical evidence at the scene, investigators determined that Roy had passed away either in the early hours of that Saturday morning or late in the evening of Friday, October 21st. As crime scene investigators processed the area, they recovered 3 projectiles from the floor. These projectiles were determined to be of a .38 caliber variety. One of the most significant initial observations made by the detectives was the complete lack of spent shell casings in the immediate vicinity of the body. In the field of ballistics, the absence of casings is a strong indicator of the type of firearm used in the commission of a crime. Unlike semi-automatic handguns, which automatically eject the empty casing after a round is fired, a revolver retains the spent casings inside its cylinder until they are manually extracted. This led the investigators to conclude that the perpetrator had likely used a .38 caliber revolver, a weapon that left behind no automatic physical trail of casings at the scene. Searching the remainder of the residence for clues, the detectives discovered an anomaly at the garage door. The wooden casing and molding around the doorframe were cracked and broken, and the lock was found in the locked position. At first glance, this physical damage suggested that an intruder might have forced entry into the home, interrupting Roy as he prepared for his National Guard duty. However, as experienced investigators began to analyze the broader context of the house, this theory began to fall apart. In a typical burglary, perpetrators generally disturb the living spaces, pulling out drawers, overturning furniture, and searching for valuable items that can be quickly liquidated, such as television sets, recording equipment, or jewelry. In this instance, nothing in the home had been disturbed. The valuable electronics and personal belongings remained completely untouched. The physical evidence of the broken door was subjected to closer inspection, which revealed an even more unsettling reality. An analysis of the wood fibers and the direction of the force indicated that the garage door had actually been forced open from the inside rather than the outside. It was not a break-in, but a break-out. This crucial distinction suggested that the damage to the doorframe had been created after Roy had already passed away. The perpetrator had deliberately damaged the door in an attempt to stage the scene, creating the illusion of a forced entry to mislead the police. This level of planning and manipulation immediately shifted the focus of the detectives toward a killer who possessed intimate knowledge of the home and had a specific, personal motive. As standard procedure dictated, the detectives began their investigation by interviewing the neighbors and gathering background information on the Taylor family. Roy Taylor had been born and raised in the small, close-knit town of Belleville, Arkansas. He grew up in a traditional, loving family environment where he enjoyed cooking in the kitchen with his mother and participating in outdoor activities such as hunting and fishing with his father. By the time Roy reached college, he had developed into an exceptionally charismatic and handsome young man, known for his striking blue eyes and engaging personality. It was during his college years that Roy met his first wife, Brenda. The two began dating after a chance encounter in a Western civilization class and were married approximately 1 year later. Brenda recalled that Roy possessed an incredible work ethic, often working night shifts and attending early morning classes, while simultaneously serving in the National Guard and working at a local automotive store. Over the course of their marriage, Roy and Brenda welcomed 2 children into their lives. For a time, Roy seemed to settle into the role of a devoted husband and father. However, as the years passed, his charismatic nature and desire for female attention began to cause significant strain within the household. Brenda eventually discovered that Roy was involved with several other women, a situation she was unwilling to tolerate. The couple divorced in 1973. Though they maintained a relatively civil relationship for the sake of their children, who lived nearby.